December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper watches his steel predators, the pride of the Panzerwaffe, tear through the American lines. For the first few hours, it feels like the Führer's insane gamble might just work. His elite Kampfgruppe Peiper, the tip of the spear in Hitler's last great offensive, is creating chaos. But Peiper isn't watching the enemy. He's watching his fuel gauges. Every lurch of his Tiger and Panther tanks drains the precious gasoline that is all that stands between a breakthrough and a frozen, useless pile of steel. The entire offensive, Germany's last hope, is built on audacity, surprise, and a prayer for fuel. They were told that the enemy would supply their advance, that the decadent, weak-willed Americans would simply abandon their vast reserves. And in the snow-covered Belgian forests, Peiper's men would indeed stumble upon an unbelievable prize, a massive American fuel dump. For a moment, it would feel like a miracle, but that miracle was a lie. The discovery wouldn't bring salvation. It would bring a soul-crushing revelation, a mathematical certainty of their own doom, and prove how American logistics would crush Hitler's last hope. By the fall of 1944, the Third Reich was being strangled. In the East, the Red Army was a relentless juggernaut grinding its way toward Berlin. In the West, Allied forces sat on Germany's doorstep. For the German High Command, the situation was catastrophic. But inside Adolf Hitler's mind, it was the canvas for one final, epic masterpiece of destruction. His plan was so audacious, it bordered on delusional. Operation Wacht am Rhein. 3 German armies, spearheaded by his best remaining panzer divisions, would smash through a weak point in the American lines in the Ardennes. They would cross the Meuse River, sever the British and American armies, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. Its capture was everything. Hitler didn't just believe it would cripple the Allied supply chain. He promised his generals that Antwerp's vast stockpiles would re-equip his own starving armies. This reliance on captured supplies wasn't just part of the plan, it was the plan. Germany was bleeding out. Allied bombers had systematically dismantled the Reich's synthetic fuel production, cutting it by a staggering 90%. The great oil fields of Ploesti, Romania, were now in Soviet hands. The effects were everywhere. The once mighty Luftwaffe was grounded. Its advanced jets couldn't fly without kerosene. On the home front, you almost never saw a civilian vehicle. The Gestapo was hunting black market gasoline dealers as if they were traitors. The sheer disparity in numbers tells the story. In 1944, the entire German war economy produced about 33 million barrels of oil. That same year, the United States alone produced 1.8 billion barrels. A single oil field in East Texas outproduced all of German-controlled Europe. While American refineries experimented with byproducts to get rid of excess crude, German quartermasters made agonizing choices about which tanks could move and which had to be left behind. Hitler's generals estimated they had only enough fuel for a third of the journey to Antwerp. The rest, they were told, would be provided by the enemy. The dice were loaded as the panzers rolled into the snow, praying for that miracle. The armored fist of the offensive was the 6th Panzer Army, led by SS General Sepp Dietrich, and its sharpest point was Kampfgruppe Peiper. Peiper and his men were the embodiment of Nazi military ideals, fanatical, battle-hardened, and equipped with some of the most feared fighting vehicles of the war. Their weapons were the apex predators of the German arsenal, the Tiger II and the Panther. The Tiger II, with its thick, sloped armor and monstrous 88mm gun, was practically immune to any Allied tank from the front. The Panther was arguably the war's best all-around tank, but they shared a terrible, unquenchable thirst. Peiper knew each of his Tiger IIs drank roughly 2.5 gallons of gasoline for every single mile it crawled forward. In the rough Ardennes terrain, that number could easily double. For every 1 gallon of fuel an American Sherman burned, a Tiger II burned 3. For a country with no fuel, fielding an army of such gas guzzlers was a paradox born from a flawed philosophy: the belief that superior quality could always defeat inferior quantity. But that philosophy ignores a basic truth. A tank that can't move is just a very expensive pillbox. Keeping them moving was a logistical nightmare. The variety of vehicles in a panzer division, once a strength, now meant different engines needed different fuels and parts. Countless trucks were needed to haul fuel to the front, each one a priority target for the Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos that owned the skies. By December 1944, the German supply chain was a study in desperation. Fuel was siphoned from damaged vehicles. Captured Allied jeeps were immediately drained. A commander like Peiper might have nearly 100 tanks, but if he only had fuel to move 30, his force was effectively crippled. The plan was for these thirsty predators to live off the land, to feed on the arteries of their enemy. They were hunters sent into the wild, expected to be sustained by their prey. While Germany fought on fumes, America fought a global war on a geyser of petroleum. To the American GY, fuel was like air. It was just always there. The colossal system that made this possible was one of the greatest triumphs of the war. At its heart was the Red Ball Express. When Allied armies advanced so quickly, they outran their supply lines. The solution was a 24/7 convoy of trucks on a one-way loop, roads closed to all other traffic. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks, most of them rugged GMC Jimmies, driven by predominantly African-American soldiers, became the lifeblood of the advance. In just 82 days, they delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies. The operation itself was so massive, it consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel per day just to keep its own trucks moving. A German army group commander would have wept to see that much fuel. But that was just one piece. An even more incredible feat was Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. Flexible, 3-inch pipelines were laid across the English Channel, pumping a continuous, unstoppable river of fuel directly to the continent. From coastal depots, smaller pipelines branched out, following the armies like a circulatory system, pumping hundreds of thousands of gallons a day to the front. The scale is staggering. In late 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe burned through 7.5 million gallons of fuel daily. The U.S. First Army, the very force that would take the German attack, kept a reserve of 3.5 million gallons. One of the larger pipelines alone could deliver 300,000 gallons a day. This wasn't just a numbers advantage, it changed the Allied mindset. American commanders planned operations with the comforting knowledge that fuel was a given. While German generals agonized over every kilometer, American generals planned attacks across entire countries. This rolling tide of petroleum was about to collide with the sputtering advance of the panzers. On December 16th, the Ardennes shattered. The German offensive achieved total surprise. Through the gaps in the American lines poured the men and machines of Kampfgruppe Peiper. The advance was a race against their own fuel tanks. Then, near the village of Honsfeld, they hit the jackpot. Overrunning a rest area for an American armored division, they found it, a U.S. fuel and supply depot. To the fuel-starved German soldiers, it was paradise. After years of scrounging for every drop of foul-smelling ersatz fuel, they stood in a forest that was a monument to industrial plenty. A German officer saw walls of sturdy, American-made jerry cans stacked 10 feet high, forming long corridors through the trees. The air, thick with pine and snow, now carried the sharp, intoxicating scent of high-grade, 80-plus octane gasoline. A world away from the 74-octane fuel their own engines were forced to drink. The initial report was euphoric: 50,000 gallons. This single minor capture was more fuel than many German divisions had seen in months. It was enough to refuel Peiper's entire battle group and power their dash to the Meuse River. The men were ecstatic. They saw it as a sign. The decadent Americans were careless with their wealth, and the disciplined German soldier would seize it for his victory. For a brief moment in that cold forest, it felt like the gamble was paying off. Hope, a resource even scarcer than fuel, flooded through the ranks. They had found their El Dorado. The elation was intoxicating. But as German officers began organizing their miraculous bounty, a cold, unsettling feeling crept in. Among the crates of rations and ammo, they found discarded American newspapers. On the jerry cans themselves, they found shipping manifests. A logistics officer would have looked at these documents with a growing sense of dread. The newspapers were recent. The manifests told an impossible story. These jerry cans, filled with gasoline refined in far-off Texas, had crossed the Atlantic, been unloaded in France, and trucked to this forward depot in less than 6 weeks. This wasn't some forgotten stockpile. This was a single drop from a constantly flowing river. The true psychological collapse came with an even bigger discovery. They learned about the Allied pipeline system. They learned that a single pipe, one of several feeding the front, could deliver 300,000 gallons of fuel a day. A German panzer division might burn through that much in a month of intense combat. Here was an invisible tube in the ground that delivered more fuel in 24 hours than an armored division could hope for in 30 days. Suddenly, that 50,000-gallon jackpot seemed pathetic. It wasn't a strategic prize. It was pocket change. It was the equivalent of a millionaire dropping a $20 bill on the sidewalk and not bothering to go back for it. The Americans hadn't lost this fuel. Its loss was a mere inconvenience. For years, German propaganda had painted America as a soft mongrel nation incapable of total war. That lie now lay shattered in the snow. As one German soldier later wrote, there was a profound demoralization, a mix of awe and despair at the sheer material wealth of the American soldier. How could you possibly defeat an enemy who treated a treasure that could save your entire army as little more than a rounding error? The discovery of that fuel dump was the moment they knew, with cold certainty, that the war was already lost. This shift from tactical victory to strategic despair is one of the most fascinating parts of the Battle of the Bulge. It shows that wars are won not just on the battlefield, but on the factory floor and in the minds of the soldiers. If you love these kinds of deep dives into the hidden logistics and psychology of war, take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The true, mind-bending extent of America's power wasn't shown by the fuel the Germans found, but by the fuel they were denied. American commanders made a simple, ruthless calculation. If the Germans needed their fuel, that fuel had to be destroyed. What followed was an act of material destruction so profound, so alien to the German mindset, it was one of the ultimate flexes in military history. Near Stavelot, right in Peiper's path, lay another depot. Not 50,000 gallons. This one held 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. As Peiper's tanks drew closer, a small group of American engineers received their orders. Destroy it all. Imagine the German perspective. Your tanks are running on fumes. Your nation's last hope is grinding to a halt. Then, over the next hill, you see a pillar of black smoke. You hear a roar, and you see American soldiers methodically opening the spigots on thousands of fuel drums, letting the precious liquid pour into ditches and setting it on fire. At Stavelot, at Malmedy, at Spa, the story was the same. American engineers opened valves and tossed in grenades. An estimated 8 million gallons went up in smoke in the first week of the battle alone. That single week of intentional destruction was more gasoline than the German High Command had allocated for the entire Ardennes Offensive. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible waste. It was like watching a starving man burn down a granary. To the Americans, it was sound doctrine. The loss was trivial. The supply chain was already compensating. On December 17th, the U.S. First Army destroyed 2.2 million gallons. The very next day, 1.8 million gallons were delivered to them. By Christmas Eve, their total fuel reserves had actually increased since the battle began. This act sealed Kampfgruppe Peiper's fate. Blocked by stubborn resistance, their promised fuel now just smoke in the sky, their advance sputtered to a halt near La Glaise. Peiper's mighty Tiger IIs became immobile steel coffins. On Christmas Eve, he was forced to abandon them all. Of the 5,000 elite soldiers who started the attack, only 800 made it back to German lines, on foot. They weren't beaten by superior tanks. They were beaten by an empty fuel gauge and an enemy who could afford to fight with fire. When the guns fell silent in January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was hailed as a great American victory. And it was. But it was really won long before the first shot was fired. It was won in the oil fields of Texas, the factories of Detroit, and the shipyards of California. The Ardennes Offensive was the death rattle of the German war machine. It threw its last elite troops and best armor into the fight, and lost it all. The most fundamental reason for the failure was logistics. The whole plan was a fantasy built on capturing supplies from an enemy that had too much to lose. Let's go back to that stark contrast. In 1944, the U.S. produced over 50 times more crude oil than Germany. While German industry was bombed into rubble, Ford's Willow Run factory was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. American shipyards were launching cargo ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The battle was the moment this statistical reality became an undeniable psychological truth. It was the brutal end of the romantic notion that superior will could triumph over material disadvantage. The image of the dashing Panzer ace was made obsolete by the anonymous truck driver on the Red Ball Express. As Churchill himself said, petrol governed every movement. Stalin was more blunt. The war was decided by engines and octane. The German soldiers who stumbled on that fuel dump thought they had found the key to victory. What they had actually found was a yardstick that measured the vast, unbridgeable chasm between their exhausted nation and the industrial colossus they had so foolishly underestimated. They were fighting with a sword against an enemy wielding a production line. The story of the Battle of the Bulge and the American fuel dumps is a microcosm of the entire Second World War. The discovery of that one stockpile, representing more wealth than a German division could dream of, became a symbol of a war that had moved beyond the battlefield. It was a clash between two systems. One was running on the last fumes of a fanatical ideology. The other was powered by an almost limitless river of industrial production. The German soldiers' shock wasn't just about the fuel, it was the soul-crushing realization that they were fighting an enemy who could afford to be wasteful on a scale they couldn't even imagine. It proved that in modern war, the greatest weapon isn't always a tank. but the ability to supply it endlessly. What other overlooked aspects of military history do you think deserve a deeper look? Are there other battles where logistics, not tactics, told the real story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this dive into the industrial sinews of war, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It's 1940. The world is on fire. The Nazi war machine, a terrifyingly efficient juggernaut, has steamrolled Poland, devoured Denmark and Norway, and is now sweeping through France with almost casual ease. The British are trapped at Dunkirk, their backs against the sea, and the swastika is flying over Paris. From his opulent headquarters, the man often called the second most powerful in the Third Reich, the head of the seemingly invincible Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, is at the absolute peak of his power. Meanwhile, an ocean away, President Franklin D. Roosevelt watches the storm clouds gathering. He goes before Congress with a plea that sounds not just audacious, but downright fantastical. He asks the nation to get ready to produce an unprecedented 50,000 military aircraft a year. Now, to put that into perspective, in all of 1939, the United States had scraped together just 2,141 military planes. The entire American aviation industry was a boutique operation next to the industrial titans of Germany. Roosevelt's request sounded like a desperate, impossible dream. When news of this absurd proposal reached Göring, he just laughed. Surrounded by his generals, basking in the glow of endless victories, he scoffed at the very idea. What could a distant, decadent, commercial republic possibly know about building the tools of war? The Americans, he reportedly jeered with utter contempt, are very good at making refrigerators and razor blades. He could not have been more wrong. That one arrogant boast, born from a deep-seated ideological blindness, would become a reverse prophecy. That moment of mockery was the quiet click before a landslide. Göring didn't know it, but his words weren't just a dismissal. They were an unintentional challenge, a challenge that America would meet not with speeches, but with a torrent of steel, aluminum, and fire. An industrial tsunami that wouldn't just defy the Third Reich, but utterly bury it. This is the story of how one man's hubris woke a sleeping giant. The story of how a nation of shopkeepers and farmers built the arsenal of democracy and, in doing so, sealed the fate of Hermann Göring and his 1,000-year Reich. To really get the scale of Hermann Göring's blunder, you have to understand the man and the ideology that blinded him. By 1940, Göring wasn't just a military leader, he was a symbol of the Nazi regime's swaggering success. A decorated fighter ace from World War I, he was the last commander of the legendary Flying Circus, once led by the Red Baron himself. He cultivated this image of a boisterous, larger-than-life figure, draped in custom uniforms and dripping with stolen art. In his own mind, he was a Renaissance man living out a grand destiny. His public pronouncements were exercises in pure arrogance. As the war began, he famously promised the German people, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Göring. You may call me Meyer." Since Meyer is a common German name, it was a boast of absolute certainty. A few months later, as his Luftwaffe prepared to hammer Great Britain, he asked, "My Luftwaffe is invincible." And so now we turn to England. How long will this one last? 2, 3 weeks. This was the mindset that heard Roosevelt's call for 50,000 planes and laughed. It wasn't just overconfidence, it was a fundamental underestimation of his enemy, rooted in core Nazi beliefs. The Nazis saw America as a soft, racially mixed, materialistic society, obsessed with consumer comforts. To them, a nation that celebrated jazz and Hollywood, a mongrel society without the supposed purity and martial discipline of the Aryan race, could never muster the will for total war. Sure, they were good at making fancy cars and refrigerators, but that was a frivolous skill, not one that could forge the weapons of a superpower. This ideological blindness was so profound that it led Göring and Hitler to ignore their own intelligence. German military attachés in the United States were sending back increasingly alarmed reports about the sheer scale of American industrial potential. They saw the vast factories of Detroit, the endless railways, the immense resources. They warned that if this sleeping giant were ever fully awakened, it could outproduce the entire Axis by itself. But these reports were dismissed. The leadership in Berlin simply couldn't, or wouldn't, believe them. To them, American boasts were just bluffs from a nation of bluffers. Even in his post-war interrogations, Göring admitted this catastrophic miscalculation. He told an American psychiatrist he truly believed Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury. That famous remark about refrigerators wasn't just a flippant line. It was a deeply held conviction. "It was the greatest miscalculation of my life," he confessed, adding a chillingly poetic final thought. "They buried us under an avalanche of production." But in 1940, that avalanche was still just a rumble in a distant mountain. The world saw an America with fewer than 3,000 military aircraft, an army smaller than Portugal's, and a public deeply divided about getting into another European war. Göring saw weakness. He failed to see the one thing that would make all the difference: the colossal, untapped power of American industry, and the one man Roosevelt would choose to unleash it. While Göring was basking in the glory of his European conquests, a very different kind of man was sitting in a Detroit living room, about to change the course of history. His name was William S. Knudsen, and he was the polar opposite of the flamboyant Reichsmarschall. Where Göring was aristocratic and bombastic, Knudsen was a humble Danish immigrant, a quiet giant of industry. Born in Copenhagen in 1879, Signius Wilhelm Pohl Knudsen came to America in 1900 at age 20 with little more than a dream and a knack for mechanics. He took odd jobs in shipyards and railroad shops, teaching himself English by listening to kids in the neighborhood. His was the classic American immigrant story. He landed a job at a bicycle factory that soon started making parts for a new automaker, the Ford Motor Company. Knudsen was a natural. He had an intuitive genius for production, foreseeing not just how to make one of something, but how to make thousands, then tens of thousands, efficiently and perfectly. He shot up the ranks at Ford, becoming a key architect of the mass production system that made the Model T a global icon. After a falling out with the notoriously difficult Henry Ford, Knudsen was poached by rival General Motors in 1922. There, his star rose even higher. As president of Chevrolet, he turned it into a powerhouse that eventually outsold Ford. By 1937, the Danish immigrant who had arrived with nothing was the president of General Motors, the largest industrial corporation on Earth. In May 1940, the same month Göring was mocking America's industrial might, Knudsen got a call from the White House. President Roosevelt needed a man who could turn his fantastical goal of 50,000 planes a year into a reality. He needed a production genius. He needed Big Bill Knudsen. Knudsen gathered his family and told them he was leaving his high-paying job at GM for Washington. When one of his children asked why, his answer was simple: "This country has been good to me, and I want to pay it back." He agreed to work for the government for a salary of $1 a year becoming the most famous of the dollar-a-year men, corporate executives who lent their expertise to the war effort for a nominal fee. Roosevelt put him in charge of the Office of Production Management. Later, in an unprecedented move, Knudsen would be commissioned as a lieutenant general in the U.S. Army, the only civilian in American history to enter the service at such a high rank, a sign of just how critical his mission was. His task was monumental. He had to convince a deeply competitive and individualistic collection of American companies to set aside their rivalries, abandon profitable civilian products, and convert their factories to build the complex machinery of war. He was asking blacksmiths to make watches overnight. He had to orchestrate the greatest industrial pivot in world history. And he had to do it faster than anyone thought possible. Göring had laughed at a nation of refrigerator makers. He was about to find out what happens when a refrigerator maker, guided by a genius like Bill Knudsen, decides to build a bomber. The challenge facing Knudsen was staggering. Building a car and building a bomber are worlds apart. A 1940s automobile had about 15,000 parts. A B-24 Liberator heavy bomber had an incredible number of parts, estimated at nearly 500,000. Car bodies were stamped from steel. Aircraft were meticulously assembled from lightweight aluminum. An engine failure in a car leaves you on the side of the road. An engine failure in a bomber over enemy territory was a death sentence. Many in the established aviation industry were skeptical. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, famously quipped, "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight." What they failed to grasp was that Knudsen wasn't just a blacksmith. He was the man who had invented the modern blacksmith shop. He immediately began applying the ruthless logic of auto mass production to the cottage industry of aircraft manufacturing. He and a team of fellow executives, the automobile men, toured aircraft plants and were horrified by what they saw. Planes were being built one at a time, by hand, like custom suits. It was slow, inefficient, and impossible to scale. Knudsen's gospel was simple: break it down. Any complex process could be broken into a series of smaller, repeatable steps. He envisioned a system where huge components like wings and fuselages would be built as standardized sub-assemblies in factories all across the country. These finished modules would then ship to massive new plants for final assembly. It was the automotive assembly line, but on a scale the world had never seen. The transformation was electric. General Motors alone converted over 100 plants. Cadillac started building M5 Stuart tanks. Pontiac made anti-aircraft cannons. Buick built the Pratt and Whitney engines that would power the very bombers Göring thought were a fantasy. Almost overnight, the entire industrial landscape of America shifted. Civilian car production was banned, and the full might of American manufacturing turned to war. The numbers tell a story of unbelievable speed. In 1939, the U.S. built just over 2,100 military planes. In 1940, that number more than doubled to over 6,000. By 1941, the year of Pearl Harbor, it shot to over 19,000. In 1942, as the conversion really hit its stride, America produced a staggering 47,836 aircraft, nearly hitting Roosevelt's impossible goal in just 2 years. And it didn't stop. In 1943, the number soared to 85,898. And in the peak year of 1944, American factories churned out an incredible 96,318 airplanes. All told, the United States produced more aircraft during the war than Germany and Japan combined. The avalanche Göring had unknowingly predicted was now thundering down the mountain. Of all the symbols of this industrial miracle, none was more powerful or more audacious than a single factory built on a creek bed in rural Michigan. It was called Willow Run. When Henry Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, came back from inspecting Consolidated Aircraft's B-24 plant in San Diego, he was so electrified by the challenge he couldn't sleep. In one night, he sketched out a plan for a new kind of factory, one that would build bombers not by the day, but by the hour. The result was the Willow Run bomber plant. Designed by the famed architect Albert Kahn, it was the largest factory under a single roof in the world. The main building was over half a mile long, and its assembly line made a famous 90-degree turn just to fit on the property. But the start was rough. The B-24 Liberator was a notoriously complex beast, with an estimated 400,000 rivets alone. Ford's engineers, used to the simplicity of cars, struggled. Early production was a nightmare of bottlenecks and delays. The factory was so plagued with issues that people gave it a cynical nickname, Will It Run? This is where the genius of men like Knudsen and Sorensen truly shone. They tackled the problems with relentless innovation. When riveting by hand was too slow, they developed hydraulic riveting machines. They broke down complex assemblies into smaller, more manageable sub-assemblies. And they had to deal with a constant stream of design changes from the front lines, all while keeping the main line moving. A feat of flexibility Germany's rigid system could never match. Slowly but surely, they worked out the bugs. The trickle of planes became a stream, and then a flood. By early 1944, the Will It Run joke was dead. At its absolute peak, the Willow Run factory was rolling a finished B-24 Liberator off its mile-long assembly line every 63 minutes. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Think about that. One factory, in 1 month, was producing more heavy bombers than many nations could build in a year. At one point, the Army Air Force had to tell Ford to slow down. They were running out of places to park the finished planes. Goering had laughed at a country that made refrigerators. Ford had turned a patch of Michigan farmland into a machine that spit out a 4-engine heavy bomber every single hour. The story of Willow Run is an incredible testament to what a determined nation can achieve, and it's a key part of the World War II story that often gets overlooked. If you find these stories of industrial history as fascinating as we do, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Machines and factories were only half the equation. The other half, the true secret weapon of the arsenal of democracy, was its people. While the Nazi regime relied on the brutal and inefficient system of slave labor, America mobilized a willing, diverse, and democratic army of civilians. At its peak, the U.S. aircraft industry alone employed 2 million people. With millions of men joining the armed forces, a massive labor vacuum was filled by groups who had never been a major part of the industrial workforce before. The most iconic of these new workers was Rosie the Riveter. Across the country, some 6 million women joined the war industries. By 1943, women made up a massive portion of the aircraft industry's labor force. The symbol was even personified by a real woman, Rose Will Monroe, who worked as a riveter on B-24s at Willow Run. She, and millions like her, proved they were more than capable of handling the demanding work of building war machines. But the Rosies were just part of the story. The demand for labor broke down barriers all across society. African Americans, Mexican Americans, the disabled, and even the elderly flocked to the factories. For the first time, in places like the Richmond shipyards, integrated crews of men and women of all races worked side by side. While the National War Labor Board promoted the ideal of equal pay for equal work, and it was a radical step, in practice, wage disparities often persisted. Still, The factory floor became an unwitting pioneer for social change. This stood in stark contrast to the Nazi system. Germany's use of forced labor was not only a moral abomination, but also an industrial liability. Enslaved workers had every reason to sabotage the products they were forced to build, leading to weapons plagued with reliability problems. The American system, on the other hand, thrived on cooperation. Workers on the factory floor suggested improvements that increased efficiency. It proved, in the most dramatic way possible, that a free and motivated workforce could outproduce, out-innovate, and out-fight the most brutal totalitarian regime on Earth. For Hermann Göring, the laughter was long gone. The mockery had curdled into a sickening dread. The avalanche of production he had dismissed was now a daily reality, roaring over the skies of his homeland. His boast that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr had become a bitter joke. German citizens, huddled in air raid shelters, sarcastically called the wailing sirens Meyer's trumpets, a permanent reminder of his broken promise. The industrial tsunami unleashed by men like William Knudsen had crashed onto Fortress Europe. By 1944, the air war wasn't a contest anymore. It was an execution. The sheer numbers were overwhelming. When the Luftwaffe lost a plane, it was a grievous blow. When an American bomber went down, it was a tragedy for the crew. But for the Army Air Forces, it was a logistical footnote. The B-24 lost over Germany in the morning was replaced by another one rolling off the Willow Run line that afternoon. The Allies could sustain losses that would have wiped out the Luftwaffe in weeks and still grow stronger. This enabled the round-the-clock bombing campaign that systematically dismantled Germany's ability to wage war. By day, the American 8th Air Force flew massive 1,000-plane raids with B-17 and B-24s, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. By night, the British Royal Air Force continued the assault. They targeted oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, and the very factories where Germany was trying to build its own planes. Göring's Luftwaffe, bled white and unable to replace its losses, could do little to stop it. The final, crushing proof of this industrial superiority came on June 6, 1944. On D-Day, as the largest invasion fleet in history assembled, 11,000 Allied aircraft controlled the skies, completely unchallenged. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had dominated Europe 4 years earlier, could barely muster 100 flights to oppose the invasion. The game was over. The war ended, and Hermann Göring, stripped of his medals and his power, found himself in a prison cell at Nuremberg. During the trial, he was confronted with the legacy of his arrogance. The American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, presented him with the evidence of America's production miracle, the endless lists of ships, tanks, and, of course, airplanes. Confronted with his own office's reports detailing the superiority of American aircraft, Göring's bluster finally failed him. The truth was undeniable. In a lost prison interview from 1945, he finally confessed the strategic blindness that had doomed his regime. He admitted he believed his own propaganda about American softness, and that he, more than many others, had a glimmer of understanding of America's latent power. It was, he admitted, a power that could be resorted to. But by the time he truly understood it, it was far too late. Göring was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. He would cheat the hangman by taking his own life just hours before his execution. But his fate had been sealed years earlier. Not in a courtroom, but in the moment he chose to laugh at a sleeping giant. This story is more than just an anecdote. It's a powerful lesson in the folly of hubris. The victory was won by the courage of soldiers and airmen on the front lines. but it was made possible by the quiet genius of men like William Knudsen and the unheralded work of millions of ordinary citizens on the home front. They were the ones who answered the call, who turned their car factories into bomber plants, and who proved that the true strength of a nation lies not in its boasts, but in its ability to build.